The royal nursery of Oakhaven Keep was not designed for the comfort of small things. Built into the highest point of the northernmost tower, its thick granite walls swallowed the hearth's heat faster than dying embers could produce it. Winter seeped through the ancient mortar, settling into the castle's bones. The grand velvet tapestries depicting the Sterling lineage did little to stop the draughts, their heavy gold threads offering status rather than warmth. Eva Vance did not mind the cold. She had spent enough of her life learning not to shiver in front of people who would view it as weakness. Cold was a condition managed with thick wool and disciplined breathing. She kept her gaze fixed on the soot-stained flagstones, her calloused hands wrapped firmly around the ash-wood handle of her broom. The stiff bristles made a dry, scratching sound against the rock, establishing a steady cadence of labor. In the far corner of the massive room, tucked deep into the shadow of a heavy crimson curtain, sat the royal heir. Leo Sterling was exceptionally small for his age, his pale hair falling over eyes that watched everything and betrayed nothing. Dressed in a formal midnight blue tunic, entirely useless against the draughts, he held a wooden wolf toy tightly against his chest. His knuckles were white, and his thin shoulders were hiked up, as if bracing for a sudden blow. High-ranking court ladies rarely visited, but when they did, they filled the air with loud, performative cooing. They brought sugared plums and demanded the mute pup perform gratitude. When he only shrank further into the shadows, they whispered in the corridors, labeling him a ruined heir. Eva did not bring sugared plums, and she did not ask for words. Silence was a kind of armor, thinner than most but lighter to carry. Instead, she offered the boy a rhythm. She swept the ash from the hearthstones in a calculated cadence, moving her arms with deliberate slowness. The sound echoed softly, filling the vast space with a predictable heartbeat. It was the exact resting tempo of a sleeping winter wolf, a deeply grounded rhythm vibrating faintly through the floorboards. Eva refused to demand anything from a child who had already been stripped of his voice and safety. She simply kept the rhythm steady, a quiet promise that he was not alone. Slowly, the painful tension began to bleed out of the child's small hands. The wooden toy lowered an inch, and his shoulders dropped. He leaned his head back against the cold stone wall, his erratic breathing stretching out to match the scratching bristles. The connection between them required no pack magic and no biological compulsion. It was built entirely on shared, predictable safety. The rhythm broke the moment the air shifted in the room. Eva paused, her broom hovering exactly 1 inch above the grey flagstones. The sudden cessation of sound made the boy blink, his small fingers tightening around the wooden toy once more. Eva kept her posture completely relaxed, her lungs expanding slowly to test the invisible currents. A draught was bleeding in from beneath the heavy, iron-bound oak door. It did not carry the biting scent of the northern wind or the familiar residue of the kitchen fires. It smelled wrong, carrying a synthetic sharpness that had no place in the royal wing. Eva set the broom gently against the stone mantelpiece. She moved with quiet precision, crossing the vast nursery without a sound. Kneeling by the baseboards near the corridor entrance, the cold bit instantly through her coarse, wet canvas apron, chilling her kneecaps. Her attention remained focused on the narrow gap beneath the door. A dark puddle was pooling in the recessed groove of the masonry. At first glance, it looked like spilled water catching the faint, grey light, but the edges of the puddle did not spread like water. It clung to the porous stone, thick and viscous. Eva pressed the edge of her sleeve into the liquid, watching the fabric turn from pale grey to translucent black before raising her wrist to her face. The scent hit the back of her throat instantly. It was sweet, almost cloying, with a heavy chemical undercurrent that made her eyes water. It was not the cheap rendered tallow used in the servants' quarters, nor the expensive floral beeswax of the sovereign private halls. It was paraffin oil, highly refined and pure. She mentally sorted the keep's inventory with administrative coldness. Paraffin of this specific purity was rare, kept strictly in the southern stables and managed directly by the stable master, Rupert Finch. It was used exclusively to treat royal carriage leather and fuel brass lanterns during blizzards. There was absolutely no logical reason for it to be seeping under the nursery door. The puddle was growing steadily, forming a continuous, deliberate trail from the outside corridor. She felt the hollow ache that arrived with the quiet verification of a long-held suspicion. The royal keep was not a fortress, but a trap where the rigid pack hierarchy actively worked to erase the vulnerable in the dark. She turned her head slowly, looking back to where the young heir sat. The boy was watching her, his pale eyes wide, and his posture rigid as he sensed the sharp shift in atmospheric pressure. The heavy stench of highly flammable oil entirely overpowered the scent of the dying hearth. Eva did not scream for the guards or run to the barred oak door. Instead, she calculated the physical distance between the rapidly expanding pool of oil, the heavy timber beams overhead, and the small, trembling child. Her muscles pulled tight under her wet canvas apron, her mind discarding every instinct for self-preservation, preparing for the exact fraction of a second when the saturated air would inevitably catch fire. The ignition was not a slow creep of flame, nor a gentle curl of smoke. It was a concussive shockwave that punched the breath entirely out of Eva's lungs. The solid oak door of the nursery, the singular exit leading back to the safety of the main keep, splintered inward with a deafening crack. A wall of blinding, roaring orange heat surged through the corridor frame, propelled by the highly combustible, sweet-smelling paraffin. The sudden shift in pressure sucked the cold northern draft out of the room, replacing it instantly with blistering, suffocating heat. Burning timbers from the outer hall's ceiling collapsed across the threshold. The ancient wood, dry as bone after a long winter, shattered upon impact with the flagstones, sending a vicious shower of bright sparks across the woven carpets. In the span of a single breath, the exit was completely sealed by a jagged barricade of fire. Eva did not scream. Panic was a luxury she could not afford, and she had spent her entire life learning not to wait for salvation. The air in the room was rapidly turning to poison, thick with the black exhaust of burning oil. She dropped her broom and immediately oriented her focus away from the blocked door. Her mind mapped the geometry of the nursery with brutal efficiency. The thick velvet curtains were already catching, the flames climbing the fabric like starving insects. The grand four-poster bed was a death trap waiting to ignite. The only defensible structure in the rapidly disintegrating room was the heavy oak desk situated near the western wall. And beneath it, pressed as far back into the shadows as his small body would allow, was Leo. The silver pup had not shifted into his wolf form, nor had he made a sound. He was entirely frozen, his wide, pale eyes reflecting the chaotic dance of the flames. The sheer magnitude of the noise and light had paralyzed him, trapping him in a deep, silent terror. The ambient heat spiked, blistering the skin on Eva's forearms. She moved. She threw herself across the open expanse of the floor, scrambling low on her hands and knees beneath the escalating blanket of toxic smoke. The flagstones beneath her palms were already growing uncomfortably hot, the air above her searing her throat with every shallow gasp. She reached the edge of the oak desk just as a decorative tapestry on the adjacent wall burst into a sheet of pure flame. The violent flare of light was blinding. Eva did not hesitate. She slid under the low wooden overhang, wedging her body tightly into the confined space beside the trembling child. Her hands, rough from years of scrubbing cold floors, moved with absolute precision. She clamped her palms gently but firmly over Leo's face, physically shielding his sensitive eyes from the blinding glare of the burning room. His small chest heaved against her arm, his breath hitching in silent gasps. He was trembling so violently the vibration transferred directly into her own bones. Eva pressed her cheek against his hair, orienting her senses to the structural sounds. The ceiling beams above them, groaned under the intense thermal stress. The thick oak desk offered a momentary canopy, but it would not hold back the ambient heat for long, nor would it stop the primary structural timbers if the roof gave way. She had a matter of seconds to make a choice. The temperature beneath the desk climbed to an agonizing degree. The air was becoming too thick to breathe, heavy with the taste of grey ash and the residue of burning paraffin. Eva reached down to her waist and unfastened the tight knot of her wet canvas apron. She had spent the last hour in the freezing scullery washing large iron pots, and the layered fabric was still deeply saturated with cold water. It was the only material barrier she possessed. With calculated movements, she pulled the sodden material off her waist and threw it completely over Leo's shivering form. She tucked the edges of the heavy cloth tightly under his knees and shoulders, creating a damp cocoon that covered everything but his nose and mouth. The fabric immediately began to steam as the superheated air washed over it, but the thick layers of wet canvas would insulate his fragile skin from the direct heat and the raining embers. "Do not move," she whispered into the dark space beside his ear. "I have you." A horrifying structural crack echoed through the chamber, louder than the roar of the fire itself. Above them, the primary crossbeam of the nursery's vaulted ceiling snapped under the extreme heat. Eva twisted her body, abandoning the relative safety of the desk's inner corner to throw herself completely over the child. She pulled her knees up and arched her spine, forming a rigid, physical shield over the damp fabric that covered the young heir. She pressed her face into the cold stone floor beside his head, bracing her elbows against the ground to ensure none of her own weight crushed him. Then the ceiling fell. The massive, burning wooden beam smashed through the center of the oak desk, splintering the thick wood as though it were brittle glass. The desk collapsed under the immense kinetic force, transferring the devastating blow downward. The burning timber, thick with forged iron nails and engulfed in stubborn flames, crashed directly onto Eva's exposed back and left shoulder. The physical impact drove the breath from her lungs in a brutal hollow rush, snapping her shoulder downward against the stone. The sheer weight of the timber threatened to crack her ribs, pinning her instantly to the floor, but the weight was only the beginning. The heat of the burning wood transferred instantly through the thin linen of her maid's dress, biting into her flesh with the vicious fury of a branding iron. Pain, absolute and all-consuming, tore through her nervous system. It was a localized agony that radiated outward from her shoulder blade, a searing, white-hot destruction of skin and muscle. The air smelled immediately of singed hair and burning cloth. A scream rose in her throat, an involuntary biological response to the horrific tissue damage occurring across her back. But as her mouth opened to release the sound, she felt the small, terrifyingly still body of the mute child trembling violently beneath her. If she screamed, he would panic. If he panicked, he might break cover, push out from beneath the wet canvas apron, and expose himself to the open flames. Eva snapped her jaw shut. She bit down on her own bottom lip with terrifying force. Her teeth sank through the soft tissue, breaking the skin until the sharp metallic taste of copper flooded her mouth. She swallowed the scream, burying it deep in her chest, trapping it behind the rigid lock of her jaw. The pain in her lip was sharp, a tiny anchor against the immense, crushing agony of the burning beam on her shoulder. She held her position. She did not writhe or attempt to throw the crushing timber off her back, knowing the violent motion might dislodge the protective debris, shielding the pup. The thick layer of canvas beneath her chest grew hot, the moisture evaporating rapidly into stinging steam, but it held the fire back from the child. Her fingers dug into the soot-covered flagstones, the friction tearing her nails, as she forced her body to remain entirely still under the crushing, burning weight. She closed her eyes, tasting her own blood, and let the silence swallow her agony whole. The crushing weight of the burning timber pinned her down, trapping her in a narrow pocket of breathable air against the stone floor. Heat radiated against her exposed back, absolute and suffocating, yet the only thing Eva Vance focused on was the small, trembling shape curled beneath her chest. She had pulled her heavy, wet canvas apron completely over Leo Sterling, forming a rigid tent of damp linen. The moisture trapped in the fabric hissed fiercely, evaporating into scalding steam as the flames licked the outer edges of their sanctuary. The steam burned her bare skin, turning the air directly above her spine into a blistering oven, but it kept the actual fire from reaching the silent boy. Every breath required an agonizing effort. Smoke filled her lungs, tasting of charred pine and the unnatural tang of paraffin oil. Eva did not scream. She concentrated entirely on the mechanics of her own body. She felt the child's small hands gripping the frayed hem of her dress. He was perfectly still. His silence was a terrifying testament to a young life already conditioned to endure trauma without complaint. The intense heat slowly began to recede as her nerve endings surrendered to the severe damage. A cold, heavy numbness crept down her spine, replacing the sharp agony of the burns. Her vision narrowed to a single point of grey ash on the scorched floorboards. She knew her consciousness was slipping away, but she could not afford to go slack. If she fainted, the heavy apron would collapse inward and the fire would find the boy. So Eva locked her body. She twisted her fingers into the thick hem of the wet canvas apron, gripping the rough fabric until her joints ached with the strain. She pulled the tension tight, anchoring her elbows against the stone floor. She turned her own body into a structural beam, refusing to yield even as the fire bit deeply into her left shoulder. Even as her muscles began to fail entirely, her grip remained absolute. A loud, splintering crash echoed through the smoke. Heavy iron axes bit into the jammed wooden door, followed immediately by the rush of cold drafts feeding the hungry flames. Heavy boots pounded across the stone floor, voices shouted, frantic and deep. Eva did not look up. She felt a pair of large, leather-gloved hands grab her waist, attempting to drag her backward away from the collapsed timber. But she did not move. Her fingers remained physically knotted into the fabric of the ruined apron. She had locked the protective dome around Leo so tightly that her body refused to register the arrival of rescue. Her muscles were paralyzed by absolute resolve. A royal guard, smelling heavily of ozone and panicked sweat, had to drop to his knees in the burning soot. Speaking in a low, urgent voice, he methodically pried her blistered fingers open. He broke her rigid grip joint by joint, just to release the child from her iron hold. Only when she felt the weight of Leo being lifted safely away did the remaining tension in her spine snap. The darkness swallowed her whole. The darkness was eventually replaced by a slow, creeping cold. It was not the biting chill of the winter courtyard, but a clinical, sterile temperature that smelled intensely of crushed rosemary, bitter willow bark, and sharp alcohol. Eva's awareness returned in fragmented pieces. First came the steady, rhythmic dripping of water into a tin basin. Then came the absolute quiet of the room. It was not the chaotic silence of the burning nursery, but a measured, disciplined stillness. Her body felt entirely foreign to her. She recognized the inevitable heavy ache that follows severe physical trauma. A deep, thrumming agony radiated from her left shoulder, traveling down her arm in slow, heavy waves that matched the beating of her heart. She tried to swallow, but her throat was coated in dry, stinging ash. She opened her eyes slowly, the dim candlelight stinging her sensitive pupils. The ceiling above her was made of perfectly arched grey stone, completely devoid of soot. This was not the drafty servant's quarters. The linen beneath her was far too soft. She was lying in the royal infirmary. Turning her head took immense effort. When she finally looked down, she saw her left shoulder and entire arm wrapped tightly in thick linen bandages. The fabric was pristine white, bound securely enough to restrict any accidental movement, yet layered thickly to absorb the weeping tissue beneath. The faint yellow stain of medicinal ointment bled through the topmost layer of the cloth, carrying the pungent scent of raw herbs. A shadow moved quietly beside her cot. Clara Thorne stood there, her posture perfectly straight and her expression entirely pragmatic. The royal healer's fingers were permanently stained with dark ink and dried botanical resins. She was not looking at Eva's face. She was looking down at a heavy silver pocket watch, checking the pulse point on Eva's uninjured right wrist. There was no pity in the older woman's eyes, only the sharp, calculating assessment of a professional measuring a patient's vital capacity. The sudden memory of the smoke hit Eva like a physical blow. The pup, the spilled paraffin, the falling timber, instinct immediately overrode her physical exhaustion. She had to know if the boy had survived the smoke inhalation. She tightened her core, planting her right elbow against the firm mattress, and attempted to push herself into a sitting position. The nausea struck instantly. A violent, churning wave of dizziness washed over her, draining all the remaining blood from her face and sending the stone walls spinning into a grey blur. Her breath hitched sharply in her chest, the sudden movement pulling brutally against the raw flesh of her burned shoulder. Clara Thorne noticed the subtle tensing of the girl's jaw before Eva even fully moved. The healer did not panic, nor did she offer useless words of comfort. Instead, Clara immediately placed a gentle, firm hand on Eva's uninjured right shoulder. The pressure was undeniable, pinning the maid back down against the pillows before she could do further damage to her healing skin. "Do not sit up," Clara advised, her voice a low, gravelly command that brooked absolutely no argument. "The floor is currently where the ceiling should be in your mind. Breathe through the initial wave of nausea, close your eyes, and count the dripping water." Eva gritted her teeth, obeying the instruction because it made logical sense. She focused on the sound of the tin basin across the room. 1 drop, 2 drops. The spinning sensation in her head slowly began to recede, leaving behind only the cold, sharp reality of the infirmary and the undeniable truth of her injuries. The infirmary smelled of dried lavender, bitter willow bark steeping in a copper kettle, and the sharp, medicinal sting of clear alcohol. The heavy stone walls of Oakhaven Keep usually held a deep, freezing chill, but beneath the thick linen sheets of the low cot, Eva Vance felt as though she were trapped inside a slow-burning furnace. Her left shoulder and arm pulsed with a relentless, throbbing heat, a heavy drumbeat of agony that made her vision swim behind her closed eyelids with every beat of her own heart. She focused on the sounds around her to stay grounded. The clinking of glass vials, the crisp rustle of a stiff apron as Clara Thorne moved across the flagstones with brisk, pragmatic efficiency. Then came the heavy, uncertain thud of armored boots. "You need to step back, my prince," a guard's voice murmured, low and nervous. "The healer needs room to work. Please, let us move the stool." Eva forced her heavy eyelids open, the hearthlight sending a sharp ache through her temples. Beside her bed, a quiet standoff was unfolding. Leo Sterling, the mute young heir to the sovereign king, sat on a wooden stool that was slightly too tall for him. His face was streaked with soot, smelling faintly of the smoke that still coated Eva's lungs, but he was uninjured. He ignored the armored man, standing awkwardly nearby, terrified of touching the royal pup without permission. The child's entire focus was locked on the bed, his small fingers wrapped in a desperate grip around Eva's uninjured right hand. "Leave him," Clara instructed, not looking up from her heavy iron mortar and pestle. The grinding sound of herbs filled the cold air. "He has not moved a single inch since they carried her in. Unless the king himself walks through that door and gives the order, you will not touch that boy, and I will not waste my time fighting him for space." The guard retreated to the threshold, his armor clattering softly as he took his post. Eva watched the boy through the heavy fog of her own exhaustion. Leo was staring at her left arm, which was now bound entirely in layers of thick, pristine linen. He reached out with his free hand, moving slowly, cautiously, as if he believed she might shatter at the slightest disturbance. With his tiny, dirt-smudged thumb, he began to trace the clean, unburnt edges of the bandages. He did not touch the injured skin, tracking only the safe boundary where the white fabric met her unblemished collarbone. Eva's chest hitched as a wave of heat rolled off her burn. Beside her, Leo's chest hitched at the exact same moment. She watched him closer. His small shoulders rose and fell in perfect synchronization with her labored breaths. He was matching her. Every time the pain forced her to draw a sharp breath, his breathing mirrored the struggle, a quiet, tactile empathy that required no words. The silence stretched, broken only by their synchronized breathing, but the heavy smoke from the nursery fire had left its mark. A raw, scraping ache began to build in Eva's throat. She tried to swallow, but it felt coated in dry ash. She let out a faint, dry rasp. Clara turned immediately, pouring water from an earthen pitcher into a tin cup. "You need to drink, Eva. The smoke will settle in your chest." Clara slid her hand beneath the maid's uninjured shoulder to lift her head. The slight shift pulled directly at the blistered skin across her collarbone, sending a spike of blinding agony down Eva's spine. Eva flinched, twisting away. Her lips were severely chapped from the fire's heat, and the movement caused the corners of her mouth to crack and bleed. She panted, unable to rise toward the water. "I know it pulls," Clara said softly. "But you must swallow." Before the heel could try again, Leo released Eva's hand. He slid off the tall stool, stepping between Clara and the bed, reaching up with both hands. Clara hesitated, but the absolute determination in the boy's silver eyes made her pause. She surrendered the tin cup into his small hands. Leo climbed onto the very edge of the low mattress, holding the cup with surprising steadiness. He did not force her head up. Instead, he simply tilted the cup, waiting for her to find an angle she could manage. Eva met the gaze of the neglected pup she had thrown herself over in the flames. His eyes were wide, holding an ancient kind of sorrow that no child should ever possess. For him, she forced herself to hold completely still, burying the sharp sting in her shoulder. She parted her bleeding lips, allowing him to tip a small trickle of cold water into her mouth, trusting his small hands more than her own strength. It hurt to swallow, a scratching burn all the way down, but the liquid offered immense relief. As she took a second sip, Leo's mouth opened. The sound that came out was barely there. A dry, gravelly whisper dragged from a throat that had refused to produce speech for years. Eva, just her name, not a royal command, not a demand for comfort. Simply a confirmation that she was there, and that he knew exactly who had taken the fire for him. The silence that followed was absolute. Not the kind of silence that falls between words, the kind that swallows them whole. Clara froze by the medical tray. The armored guard at the doorway stopped breathing, his hand tightening on his sword hilt in sheer disbelief. Eva looked up into the child's silver eyes. The physical agony radiating from her shoulder was overwhelming, and moving her face was a distinct torment. Despite the pain, despite the cracked and bleeding corners of her mouth, she smiled. It was a slow, quiet curving of her lips, acknowledging the monumental weight of that single word. She gave a faint nod, letting the boy know she had heard him, and that she was not going anywhere. The heavy oak door of the infirmary groaned, yielding to a force that demanded immediate entry. The iron hinges snapped the quiet of the stone chamber. Eva's breath caught, her uninjured hand, held tightly by the small boy on the stool beside her cot, tightened around his fingers. She braced herself, anticipating a chaotic rush of guards demanding reports on the arson. Instead, the threshold was filled by a single figure. King Gideon Sterling entered the room. His massive frame seemed to consume the available light, throwing a long shadow across the pale floor. He wore a dark wool tunic and a thick riding cloak, the fabric smelling faintly of northern frost, cold iron, and the sharp ozone of a sovereign's rising panic. For the past hour, the fortress had been in an absolute uproar. He had torn through the keep, digging through ash, looking for his only heir. Eva watched him from the flat plane of her mattress, registering the dangerous tension coiled in the Alpha King's jaw. He was a hardened ruler, accustomed to commanding armies and navigating the bloody waters of pack politics. Now, his silver eyes swept the shadowed infirmary with the terrifying focus of a predator seeking its lost cub. The moment his gaze landed on the small cot in the corner, everything about the king's posture fractured. Gideon halted mid-step. The heavy thud of his boots ceased entirely. He stared at the tableau before him. The low-ranking kitchen maid, wrapped in thick linen bandages, smelling of bitter herbs and scorched skin, and the royal pup, safe and untouched, gripping her uninjured hand as though she were his only anchor to the living world. Eva tried to shift. A deeply ingrained survival instinct urged her to sit up, to lower her head in proper submission. But the searing pain radiating from her burned shoulder pinned her to the mattress, and Leo's steady grip refused to let her move. She lay perfectly still, expecting the king to snatch his son away. That was not what happened. From her vantage point, Eva saw the exact moment the suffocating weight of the king's terror broke. Gideon's broad, heavily muscled shoulders dropped, the rigid line of his spine softening completely. He simply stood in the center of the infirmary, letting the profound safety of the room wash over him. For years, the king had struggled to penetrate the wall of silence surrounding his son. He had brought the finest healers to Oakhaven Keep to construct a sanctuary the boy could trust. None of it had worked. Yet here, beside a cot meant for invisible laborers, Leo had found his safe harbor. Gideon moved slowly, closing the distance to the cot with deliberate, unhurried steps, anchoring the chaotic energy of the room simply by standing still. When Gideon reached the edge of the narrow cot, he did not stand over Eva in a display of hierarchical dominance. Instead, the sovereign lowered his massive frame, allowing one knee to hit the cold stone of the infirmary floor. Eva stopped breathing. In the rigid structure of the pack, an alpha king did not kneel before a woman whose only recorded duty was sweeping ashes before dawn. The dark velvet of his cloak pooled against the dusty floorboards, but Gideon paid it no mind. His silver eyes were entirely focused on her face, tracing the exhaustion beneath her eyes and the medicinal bandages wrapping her left side. Leo shifted on his stool, letting go of Eva's fingers just long enough to lean against his father's armored shoulder. Gideon wrapped a scarred hand around his son, pulling the boy into his side with a protective grip, but he kept his gaze locked on the maid. "My lord," Eva whispered, her voice rough from the smoke. She endured a familiar, grinding torment, the sharp ache of speaking when her throat was lined with soot. She tried to pull her uninjured hand back. "You do not need to. Do not move," Gideon instructed. His voice was a low rumble, barely above a whisper, yet it carried the undeniable weight of absolute authority. He reached forward, his movement slow so she would not flinch. He did not touch her bandages. Instead, he gently placed his large, warm hand over her cold, soot-stained fingers. The contrast was stark, the powerful king holding the hand of a broken servant. "He spoke," Gideon said, the words catching slightly in his chest. "When I was searching through the burning rubble of the nursery, one of the guards told me the royal healer had taken a survivor to the lower ward. After 2 years of absolute silence, they told me he spoke a single word." Eva's pulse fluttered against his palm. The silence of the infirmary stretched, thick with the scent of pine resin and the rhythmic sound of the child breathing against his father's coat. "He said your name," Gideon continued, his eyes unguarded. There was no gold offered, no pouch of silver coins tossed onto the mattress to buy her silence. The king recognized that a physical transactions would insult the magnitude of what she had done. "You threw your own body over the timber," he said, his grip steady and grounding. "You took the fire that was meant to end my bloodline. I had my apron," Eva murmured. She focused on the material reality of the wet canvas apron rather than the emotional weight of his gratitude. She had spent enough of her life learning not to cry in front of people who would not understand why. It was the only logical shield. It was a piece of cloth. Gideon corrected gently, dismantling her deflection with quiet precision. "You are the shield." The king bowed his head, shadowing his face as he made his vow. He did not speak loudly, ensuring only Eva and the child could hear the words. "As long as I draw breath," Gideon swore. The syllables pressed into the quiet room like a seal into hot wax. "You will never have to sweep a cold hearth again. You will never be invisible in my court, Eva Vance. That is not a reward. That is a sovereign promise." Eva let the absolute certainty of his vow anchor her. It was a heavy, quiet truth that filled the freezing terror in her chest, replacing it with the profound warmth of being truly seen. The heavy oak door of the infirmary clicked shut. Gideon Sterling stepped into the arched corridor of the outer keep, where the temperature immediately dropped. The air tasted of frost and old stone. A small circle of his senior advisors had gathered in the shadows, their fur-lined cloaks shifting as they waited. They had been whispering, a sound not unlike the dry rustle of dead leaves over frozen mud. Gideon adjusted the cuff of his dark coat, his mind anchoring on the image of the scarred woman who had shielded his son. He turned to the captain of the Royal Guard, who stood rigidly by a stone pillar. "Have the southern chamber in the royal wing prepared," the sovereign instructed, his voice low and measured. "See that the fires are built with dry pine, and ensure the linens are the softest we hold in the keep. She will be moved there within the hour." The instruction hung in the air. The captain nodded, but a nervous throat cleared in the center of the gathered advisors. Lord Helton, a man who had spent 3 decades climbing the administrative hierarchy, stepped half a pace forward. He smoothed his velvet doublet, attempting to project a helpful diplomacy. "Your Majesty," Helton began softly, offering a shallow bow. "The southern chamber is historically reserved for visiting dignitaries. Given the young woman's station, perhaps a more comfortable room in the upper servants' quarters. There are well-heated rooms near the kitchens that would suit a maid perfectly. We would not want her to feel overwhelmed, nor disrupt the established order." Gideon stopped. He did not bare his teeth or raise his voice. That was the kind of loud, insecure dominance required by lesser men trying to prove they held power. The king occupied quiet spaces not with hesitation, but with the heavy, unmovable certainty of a lodestone. He had never felt the nervous impulse to fill the air with empty words. He simply turned his head and looked at the advisor. The silence that followed was thick and suffocating. It rolled down the stone corridor, pressing into the lungs of every man present. Gideon's posture remained perfectly relaxed, his hands loose at his sides, but the temperature seemed to plummet. His pale eyes locked onto Helton's face. He offered no argument and no philosophical defense of her worth. He merely let the weight of his quiet authority settle onto the man's shoulders like a physical anvil. Under that single, cold glance, Helton's practiced diplomatic smile faltered. The blood drained from the older man's face. He swallowed hard, taking a slow, unsteady step backward, returning to the safety of the group. He lowered his gaze to the stone floor, thoroughly dismantled, without a single word having been spoken. Gideon shifted his attention back to the guard captain. "The southern chamber in the royal wing," the king repeated, his tone entirely unchanged. Within the hour, the short walk from the utilitarian infirmary to the southern chamber exacted a brutal toll on Eva's fading strength. Every step she took, supported gently by Clara's assistance, sent a sharp, pulling ache through the thick linen bandages wrapping her shoulder. By the time the heavy mahogany door of the royal suite closed behind her, leaving her entirely alone, she was trembling from the sheer depletion of her body's resources. She stood near the center of the vast room, the soft woven rugs absorbing the sound of her unsteady breaths. The chamber was overwhelmingly warm. A massive stone hearth occupied the far wall, where thick logs of dry pine crackled steadily, filling the space with the rich scent of burning wood and sweet resin. The bed, a massive structure draped in plush velvet and pristine white silk sheets, looked like something pulled from a fairy tale she had never been allowed to read. It was too much. The luxury felt less like a reward and more like a mistake, a temporary illusion that could be instantly revoked the moment the court remembered who she truly was. She had spent enough of her life learning not to trust spaces that were too soft, because they were inevitably followed by a sharp return to the cold reality of her station. Slowly, the young woman walked toward the edge of the massive bed. She did not lie down. Instead, she sat on the very edge of the mattress, silk smooth and foreign beneath her cracked fingers. Beside her, resting on a silver tray brought up by the attendants, was a small stack of her personal belongings recovered from the chaos. On top of the pile sat her wet canvas apron. It was ruined. The heavy fabric was scorched black along the edges, stiff with dried soot and carrying the faint, lingering scent of ash and paraffin oil. It was an ugly, discarded thing in the center of an opulent, perfect room. Eva reached out with her uninjured hand and pulled the coarse fabric onto her lap. She felt the particular stiffness of the burnt canvas, the familiar weight of the pockets where she had kept her cleaning rags. This apron was the sum of her life in the keep. It was the uniform of her invisibility, the armor she wore while scrubbing floors and keeping her head down. But it was also the shield she had thrown over the sovereign heir when the ceiling collapsed in flames. Moving with slow, deliberate precision to accommodate the throbbing in her shoulder, Eva began to fold the apron. She matched the scorched corners together, pressing the rough fabric flat against her lap. She folded it once in half, then again tucking the burnt strings neatly inside the square. It was a mundane, domestic task, but the rhythm of the work steadied her breathing. It anchored her racing mind. When the folding was complete, she placed the ruined apron neatly on the polished mahogany nightstand beside the bed. It sat there, stark and unpolished, a physical anchor to her reality. It was a reminder of who she was and the concrete, painful choice she had made. She would sleep in the king's silk, but she would not let the castle forget the cost of the ash. The heavy oak door to the royal chamber did not simply open. It was pushed wide with a deliberate, performative rustle of stiff velvet and layered silk. Beatrice Halloway crossed the threshold first. The court lady carried a folded stack of white linen, holding the fabric slightly away from her pristine gown, as though the act of carrying it might contaminate her. Behind her, two younger attendants followed, their eyes darting around the luxurious room before settling with poorly concealed disdain on the figure resting in the bed. Eva did not flinch. She kept her chin level, letting the dull throb of her injured shoulder anchor her to the present moment. The air in the chamber, previously thick with the comforting warmth of burning pine, was suddenly overpowered by the sharp, suffocating scent of imported rose oil and powdered lilies. It was the scent of the upper hierarchy, a chemical sweetness designed to mask the reality of physical labor. "We brought fresh bandages," Beatrice announced, her voice a masterclass in false sympathy, pitched just high enough to sound fragile. She approached the edge of the mattress, setting the linens down on the polished cedar nightstand. The injured maid noticed immediately that the fabric was not the soft, spun cotton the royal healer utilized. It was the rough, unbleached weave assigned to the lowest scullery workers. It was a physical reminder of boundaries delivered under the guise of charity. Beatrice let her gaze drift downward, lingering intentionally on the exposed expanse of Eva's shoulder and collarbone. The skin there was an angry, mottled landscape of raw red burns and blistering edges, shining faintly where the previous layer of ointment had begun to dry. A tight, calculated sigh escaped her lips, a sound rehearsed in drawing rooms and perfected over afternoon tea. "Such a tragedy," Beatrice murmured, reaching out with a gloved finger to trace the air inches above the ruined skin, never making contact. To survive a horrific blaze, only to be left in this terrible condition. The heat must have seared straight through the tissue. It is completely ruined. Eva did not offer the tearful reaction the uninvited guest was hunting for. Silence was her method of starving the aristocrat of the drama she craved. Beatrice turned her elegant face away in mock pity. One has to wonder what will become of you now. A girl of your station already had so little to offer a prospective husband, but with these hideous marks, who could bear to look at you? You will have to wear high collars for the rest of your life, hiding in the shadows, just to spare honest men the discomfort. The two attendants exchanged knowing, cruel glances. They were waiting for the low-ranking servant to break, to pull the expensive sheets over her head and weep. Eva merely looked at the stack of rough linen. She felt the particular kind of pain that comes not from surprise, but from confirmation. The court did not care about the royal life she had shielded. They only cared about the aesthetic rules she had broken. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet a fraction of a second before the heavy footsteps registered. Gideon Sterling did not announce his arrival. He simply stood in the open doorway, his massive frame blocking the hallway light, his dark eyes locked on the tableau by the bed. He existed there like a gathering storm, listening to the final, echoing syllables of the cruel mockery. The two attendants noticed him first. The malicious amusement drained from their faces, replaced instantly by the chalky pallor of genuine terror. They dropped into deep, uncoordinated curtsies, their knees trembling against the cold stone floor. The older woman, oblivious to the shift in atmospheric pressure, turned with her patronizing smile still fixed in place. When she saw the sovereign king, the expression fractured. "Your Majesty," she breathed, hastily lowering herself into a flawless bow. "We brought the poor girl some clean linens, a small act of charity for her suffering." The sovereign stepped into the room. He did not yell. He did not roar or allow his inner wolf to project aggressive dominance. Instead, he moved with the unhurried, terrifying precision of a predator walking through a trap it had already dismantled. "Charity," he repeated. His voice was a low, resonant baritone that vibrated against the cedar walls. He walked past the bowing women and paused by the nightstand, glancing down at the rough, unbleached scullery cloth. "You speak of ugliness, Lady Beatrice. You speak of burdens and ruined prospects." The former favourite swallowed hard, her throat bobbing visibly above her high lace collar. "I only meant to offer realism, Your Majesty. It is a harsh world for a woman with such disfigurements." "The only disfigurement in this chamber," Gideon said softly, "is the profound ugliness of your character." Beatrice gasped, stepping back as though she had been struck. He finally turned his eyes upon her, the absolute lack of warmth in his stare pinning her to the floor. "You look at the woman who bled to protect my heir, and you see a ruined servant. I look at her, and I see the absolute failure of my court to understand what true nobility is." The Alpha King raised a hand, signaling the two armored sentries waiting in the corridor. They stepped forward immediately, boots ringing against the stone. "Confiscate her gloves," he ordered. Her eyes widened in panicked confusion. "Your Majesty? I do not understand." "Take them off," he commanded, the quiet authority in his tone leaving no room for negotiation. Trembling, the noblewoman peeled the pristine silk gloves from her hands, revealing perfectly manicured fingers that had never known hard labor. The sentries took the fabric without a word. "Lady Beatrice Halloway," Gideon announced, his voice carrying the formal cadence of a royal decree. "As of this moment, you are stripped of your court titles. Your new position will reflect the charity you are so eager to dispense." "Sire, please," she begged, her voice pitching into genuine hysteria. "Bring the tub," the king said, ignoring her completely. Within moments, a heavy wooden washtub was dragged into the chamber, sloshing with hot water and strong lye soap. Next to it, a guard dropped a basket filled with the injured maid's discarded, soiled medical bandages. Stiff with dried blood and carrying the bitter scent of ash, he looked down at the former noblewoman. "You will wash her linens. You will scrub the blood from these bandages with your bare hands." and you will continue to do so every day until her skin is healed." Beatrice stared in horror at the wooden tub, her bare hands shaking. The smell of the soiled cloth was undeniable, cutting through her floral perfume with brutal honesty. She sank to her knees on the stone floor, her humiliation complete and publicly witnessed. From the bed, the wounded maid watched the sovereign. He did not look at the crying woman again. Instead, Gideon turned his attention entirely to Eva, the dangerous coldness in his eyes, melting into a quiet, protective reassurance. He had dismantled the hierarchy that sought to crush her, proving that her physical sacrifice would never again go unanswered. The rhythmic, grinding sound of stone against stone filled the quiet chamber. Clara Thorne sat by the low table near the hearth, her sleeves rolled up past her elbows as she worked the heavy pestle. The royal healer did not rush. She moved with a measured, deliberate pressure, crushing fresh comfrey leaves until they surrendered their bright, sharp scent into the warm air. It smelled of wet earth, crushed stems, and the deep, cold woods before a rainstorm. Eva watched her from the center of the massive bed, her injured shoulder propped against soft pillows. The skin across her collarbone and upper arm felt tight, pulling uncomfortably with every shallow breath she took. Clara paused to inspect the paste, tilting the mortar toward the lamplight. She took a small wooden spatula, scraping the bruised green matter back into the center before resuming her methodical grinding. She had spent 20 minutes ensuring not a single coarse vein remained in the mixture. A poorly mashed leaf could drag against sensitive tissue, and the royal healer treated her work with clinical precision. There was no magic in the stone bowl, only practical botanical knowledge and the stubborn patience required to turn raw plants into medicine. "The heat is finally leaving the deeper layers," Clara said, her voice dropping into the pragmatic cadence of a woman who had seen every kind of suffering. She added a few drops of distilled water, thinning the heavy paste. "But the new skin will be fragile. This application is going to sting, Eva. It will bite at the nerve endings before the numbing properties take hold. You must remain entirely still." Eva offered a stiff nod. Her throat was still dry from the lingering memory of smoke. Years of invisible labor had taught her to swallow her tears before they could even form. The pain of the burn was a heavy, constant companion, but it was a concrete, logical pain. Clara wiped her hands on a linen cloth, scooping the thick paste into a smaller ceramic bowl. "I will apply it in thin, overlapping layers," the healer instructed, moving toward the mattress. "Breathe through the initial shock. The coldness of the comfrey salve is a stark contrast to the residual heat in your flesh. The sudden shift in temperature is what makes my patients flinch." Eva braced herself, stiffening her uninjured arm against the mattress. She fixed her gaze on the dancing flames in the fireplace, preparing to lock her jaw. She silently commanded her own pulse to slow, gathering her quiet armor. Before the royal healer could dip her spatula into the bowl, the heavy oak door of the chamber eased open. Gideon Sterling stepped into the warm light, his arrival incredibly quiet. He did not wear his formal sovereign mantle, dressed instead in a simple dark linen shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing corded muscle and faint silver scars lining his own forearms. Clara Thorne paused, the spatula hovering in the air. The king offered a low nod of acknowledgement to the older woman, stepping up to the opposite side of the bed. "I will take over, Clara," Gideon said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that barely disturbed the quiet air. It was not a request, nor an aggressive command. It was a simple statement of absolute intention. The healer looked at him for a long, measuring second, her eyes dropping to his large hands, then back to his face. Finding whatever silent assurance she required, she handed over the ceramic bowl. "Thin, overlapping layers, Your Grace," she instructed dryly, entirely unbothered by his royal title when it came to medical procedure. "And do not press down. The tissue is new." Gideon accepted the bowl, his large fingers dwarfing the delicate ceramic. He waited until the healer quietly exited the room, the heavy door clicking shut behind her, leaving them in a thick, encompassing silence. He set the bowl on the bedside table and pulled up a wooden chair, sitting close enough that Eva could feel the ambient heat radiating from his chest. He looked down at her ruined shoulder, his expression devoid of the pity or revulsion she had expected. Instead, his gaze held a deep, heavy reverence. He reached into the bowl, coating his first 2 fingers in the thick, cooling, comfrey salve. His hands were those of a warrior, covered in calluses, rough from years of gripping sword hilts, yet his movements were agonizingly slow. He held his hand suspended above her skin for a long moment, giving her time to adjust, giving her time to pull away if she wished. When she offered a barely perceptible nod, he finally lowered his hand. The application of the herbal poultice demanded a severe toll before it offered any relief. The contrast was shocking. As the crushed leaves met the raw, blistered edges of the burn, a sharp, white-hot sting flared across Eva's shoulder, combating the throbbing heat of her damaged tissue. She inhaled sharply, her teeth pressing hard into her lower lip, but she refused to pull away. The biological instinct to retreat from pain was overwhelming, yet the solid, unmovable weight of Gideon Sterling's presence anchored her to the mattress. He had set the heavy ceramic bowl on the wooden nightstand, his left hand managing the thick, green paste, while his right hand reached out and found hers. It was not a tentative gesture. The king's hand was massive, heavy with callouses, built from years of gripping iron and leather reins, and it wrapped around her uninjured fingers with a steady, unyielding grip. He did not tell her to be brave. He did not offer hollow reassurances that the agony would pass quickly, knowing such words were useless to a woman in torment. Instead, he simply offered himself as a physical counterweight to her suffering. As the second layer of the comfrey salve was spread over the deepest part of the ruined skin, the fiery sensation spiked violently. Eva's breathing fractured into a ragged gasp. Without thinking, she squeezed Gideon's hand. The pressure she exerted was immense, driven by the raw animal instinct to transfer the agony to something solid. Her knuckles turned stark white against the dark linen of the bedsheets. Her short, blunt nails dug into the thick skin of his palm, pressing hard enough to leave deep, crescent-shaped indentations. A lesser man would have flinched. A typical noble would have pulled his hand back immediately, offended by the desperate, bruising strength of a low-ranking servant. Gideon did neither. He welcomed the pressure, his own grip adjusting just enough to support the delicate bones of her hand without crushing them. He absorbed her pain the way a cold stone foundation absorbs the impact of a winter storm, silently, without breaking, without complaint. "Hold on," he murmured. The instruction was quiet, entirely stripped of royal command, leaving only the pragmatic necessity of shared endurance. He matched his breathing to hers. When her breath caught in a sharp gasp, his own chest stilled. As she slowly exhaled, letting the tension drain from her jaw, he resumed his careful, sweeping motions. He applied the salve with devastating gentleness, tracing the jagged edges of her scars, with a clinical precision that bordered on devotion. Every slow, methodical circle of his fingers sent a fresh wave of stinging heat radiating down her arm, and with every wave, Eva squeezed his hand harder. She focused entirely on the rough, uneven texture of his palm, using the physical reality of his grip to keep her mind from slipping into the dark, panicked memory of falling, burning timbers. Gradually, the sharp bite of the herbs began to change. The violent heat melted into a deep, penetrating cold. It felt like winter frost seeping directly into her marrow, numbing the exposed nerve endings and drawing the deep inflammation out of her skin. The transition was an aching chill that left her trembling against the mattress, but the immediate threat of the burning sensation was gone. Eva's grip on the king's hand finally loosened, her fingers uncurling as the sheer exhaustion of enduring the treatment washed over her. The physical exertion of the procedure left the warm chamber heavy with silence. Gideon withdrew his left hand, reaching for a clean strip of linen to wipe the remaining green residue from his fingers. He did not, however, release her right hand. The king remained seated on the low wooden stool beside the bed, his posture relaxed but entirely attentive. Eva lay back against the soft silk pillows, her chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow bursts. The adrenaline from the pain was still flooding her system, leaving her pulse racing and her neck muscles tense, as if her body was still waiting for another collapsing roof beam to strike. She closed her eyes, trying to force her erratic breathing to even out. The quiet in the room was absolute, save for the faint crackle of the hearth fire burning in the corner grate. But the stillness was not empty. Eva had spent her entire life learning to read the invisible geometry of a room, assessing the moods of volatile elites to ensure her own survival. The atmospheric pressure around the king was shifting. It was not the heavy, suffocating weight that usually accompanied a ruling sovereign. There was no oppressive demand for submission, no heavy intimidation pressing down on her chest to remind her of her place. Instead, a deep, resonant calm began to bleed into the space between them. It was his inner wolf surfacing, not to assert territorial dominance, but to establish a perimeter of absolute impenetrable safety. The shift registered entirely through her senses. The faint, metallic tang of the infirmary and the sharp, medicinal odor of the comfrey salve were slowly pushed aside by something older and much deeper. The air filled with the heavy scent of wet cedar bark, crushed pine needles, and the clean, ozone-rich smell of rain falling on cold northern earth. It was the scent of an ancient, undisturbed forest where no predator was allowed to hunt. The animal part of her brain recognized the signal immediately. It was a chemical broadcast of protection, a silent assurance that the immediate environment was entirely secure. Eva's racing pulse caught, stuttered, and then began to slow to a measured rhythm. The shallow bursts of air in her lungs deepened into long, steady breaths. The rigid tension that had locked her jaw and stiffened her spine began to dissolve, melting away under the ambient, invisible pressure of the king's controlled nature. She opened her eyes and found Gideon watching her quietly. His expression remained unreadable, his sharp features cast in the warm, flickering amber light of the hearth, but the firm grip he maintained on her hand was a physical continuation of the scent in the air. He was guarding her rest. For a woman who had spent her existence calculating exit routes and anticipating cruelty, the sensation of being entirely shielded without being owned was profoundly disorienting. True sovereignty, she realized as the fire popped softly in the grate, was not found in the volume of a man's voice or the terror he could inspire. It was found in this absolute, unmovable restraint. Gideon Sterling possessed enough strength to crush her hand with a single twitch of his muscles, yet he used that same power only to anchor her to the earth. Eva let her head tilt slightly against the pillow, the clean linen cool against her cheek. She did not try to pull her hand away from his calloused palm. The wet cedar scent wrapped around her, thicker and heavier than any woven blanket, lowering her heart rate until the persistent, aching cold of the burn faded into a manageable, distant throb. The king did not speak, and she did not try to fill the space with unnecessary gratitude. They sat together in the dim light, the silence functioning not as an awkward void, but as a heavily fortified wall holding the rest of the world at bay. The sharp, medicinal scent of the comfrey salve settled deeply into her skin, leaving a numbing coolness over her burned shoulder. Yet beneath that clean aroma, an olfactory shadow had haunted Eva's breathing since the nursery timbers fell. She rested her uninjured hand against the silk quilt. The hearth fire crackled, casting shadows on the cold stone walls. King Gideon sat opposite her in a high-backed leather chair, watching the embers. He waited, affording her the dignity of an uninterrupted thought. The fire did not start with firewood, Eva said quietly. Gideon did not demand an immediate explanation. I smelled it before the floorboards caught, she continued, It was sweet and extremely heavy, with a cloying edge. It was not the rendered tallow we burn in the servants' corridors, nor the refined beeswax used in the royal wing. Gideon's jaw tightened. "Paraffin," he said. The word was low, registering purely as a factual confirmation. "Southern paraffin," Eva corrected, "thick and unrefined. It smelled exactly like the industrial grease used on the carriage axles." She expected the instinctual dismissal a maid usually received. Instead, the king took her words as absolute material evidence. "A maid knows a fortress by its stains and scents," Eva explained. "When the laundry carts pass the western gates, the wind carries that exact smell from the axle vats. Whoever poured that oil beneath the nursery floorboards had direct access to the stable stores. They didn't steal a small flask. They brought it in heavy, industrial quantities." Gideon processed the realization, his jaw locking tight. The arsonist was not a random intruder. It was someone with authorized movement through Oakhaven Keep's defenses, someone who understood the guards' blind spots and the exact weight of oil needed to burn a royal heir alive. The king stood, his frame uncoiling with deliberate control. "Can you walk?" he asked. Not a command, but a genuine inquiry. Eva pushed the silk covers aside, her bare feet touching the cold stone floor. "I can read too," she answered. By nightfall they had relocated to the king's private study, a massive chamber of dark stone. The air smelled of dry parchment, cold iron bindings, and undisturbed ledgers. Spread across the heavy oak desk were the castle's supply registries. Eva stood on one side, her left arm secured in a fresh linen sling, her right hand carefully turning the yellowed pages of a quartermaster's log. The ink was faded, but Eva had spent years checking inventory lists. When the head cook was too drunk to manage the numbers, she knew how to scan vertical columns for anomalies. A fortress ran on its ledgers, and a lie always left a mathematical deficit. The study was dim, illuminated by a single brass lamp. Eva leaned closer to the open book, squinting at a cramped line of script. The scribe had compressed the letters, letting the dark ink bleed into the fibrous paper like a tangled briar patch. She narrowed her eyes, tracing the line with her uninjured finger. Gideon moved silently from his side of the table. He did not take the ledger from her hands. Instead, the king slid the brass oil lamp across the desk, adjusting the wick until a warm amber light washed over her page. He set it down precisely where she needed it, his large hand lingering for a fraction of a second near hers before pulling back, preserving her physical boundary. Eva paused, her breath catching slightly. The Alpha King of Oakhaven was watching the page, waiting for her analysis. It was a quiet validation. He did not just tolerate her presence. He relied on her intelligence. "Here," Eva said, her voice dropping. She tapped the column's bottom. 3 weeks ago, a bulk shipment of southern paraffin was logged at the eastern gate, 6 casks, but it was never recorded into the domestic stores for the keep's winter lighting. Gideon stepped beside her, maintaining a respectful distance from her wounded shoulder. He followed the line of her ink-stained finger. It was diverted before it reached the main courtyard. Eva continued, deciphering the abbreviated codes, routed directly to the outer grounds, signed and received in full. She moved her finger to the signature line. The ink pressed so hard into the parchment it had nearly torn the page. "The stablemaster," Eva read aloud, the certainty lodging in her chest like a sliver of cold glass. Rupert Finch. The name hung in the freezing air. Rupert Finch, a man who relied on empty status, performing elaborate bows while secretly mocking the servants. He had sneered at Eva just 2 days before the fire, kicking over her bucket of soapy water because she hadn't moved fast enough. Gideon looked at the signature, his jaw set in a hard, dangerous line. The king did not roar or surrender to the chaotic violence of a betrayed alpha. His anger was absolute, freezing certainty. He reached out, his knuckles brushing the edge of the ledger as he traced Rupert's name. The truth was no longer a ghost of a scent lingering in a kitchen maid's memory. It was written in permanent ink, backed by mathematical proof. The stablemaster ledger was the undeniable key, and Eva Vance was the one who had turned it. The outer keep smelled of damp earth and horse sweat. The wind carried a bitter chill, biting through the heavy woolen cloak Gideon had draped over Eva's uninjured shoulder. She walked beside him across the frozen mud, keeping her steps measured. The burn throbbed beneath the linen, but she refused to let the pain alter her posture. They were here for mathematics. Rupert Finch stood near the paddock doors in an immaculate leather riding coat. When he saw the sovereign approaching, he smoothed his expression into a mask of deferential respect. He bowed low, his eyes skipping over her entirely. "My king," Rupert said smoothly, "the patrols are ready." Gideon walked to the stablemaster's outdoor work table, a rough wooden plank scarred by horseshoe nails. "We are not here for the patrols, Rupert," he said quietly. Rupert blinked, finally sparing a dismissive glance in her direction. "Then how may I serve the crown?" "You can explain the paraffin," Eva said. Her voice was not loud. She had spent her life learning to speak without taking up space, but the words landed with the weight of cold iron. Rupert offered a patronizing smile. "Paraffin? The girl is confused. We use standard tallow for the lanterns. Out here we rely on the basics." It was a smooth lie, delivered with the easy confidence of a man who assumed his word would always outweigh a servant's memory. Gideon did not argue. He withdrew a thick, leather-bound book from his winter cloak. It was the stablemaster ledger. He dropped it onto the table. The heavy thud of the book, striking the wood, echoed sharply. The sound possessed a terrifying finality. Rupert stared at the dark cover. The colour drained from his face. Eva watched his hands. The polished stablemaster pressed his palms flat against his riding coat, desperately trying to conceal the violent tremor in his fingers. "Page 42, Gideon instructed softly. Rupert could not bring himself to touch the record. Eva stepped forward, flipping the heavy parchment pages. She pressed her index finger against the neat columns of ink. "3 barrels of sweet southern paraffin," she read aloud, "requisitioned directly from the main storehouse, under the seal of the stables, dated 2 days before the fire. Yet there is no paraffin out here. There is only the memory of its scent beneath the floorboards." Rupert's jaw worked as he searched for another excuse, but the numbers were right there in his own handwriting. Ink dried faster than tears in the bitter northern wind, and the documentation condemned him entirely. Gideon did not raise his voice. A single tilt of his head toward the stablemaster's private quarters was enough. 4 sovereign guards detached themselves from the shadows and moved with silent efficiency. They marched past Rupert and kicked open the wooden door of his drafty residence. Rupert flinched at the sound of splintering wood, his eyes darting toward the open doorway. Eva watched the geometry of his panic unfold. He was no longer looking at the stablemaster ledger. She could hear the scrape of heavy boots and the tearing of a wool mattress. The guards were dismantling his arrogant life, piece by piece. Then came the sharp sound of a pry bar digging into wood. Rupert let out a strangled gasp, taking a half-step forward before Gideon shifted his weight, blocking the path. The king merely occupied the space, an immovable wall of quiet authority. A moment later, the captain of the guard emerged, carrying a heavy oilcloth sack. He walked over to the table and tipped the sack forward. A cascade of metal spilled onto the scarred wood with a heavy clink, sliding across the frost-hardened planks. 1 coin rolled to a stop near her boots. It was a thick, pure silver piece, stamped with the jagged mountain crest of the Western rival pack. Treason paid in foreign currency. 30 pieces of Western silver. Gideon observed, his voice dropping to a low register. The price for burning a child alive in his bed. Rupert Finch's knees gave out. He collapsed onto the freezing dirt. The gravel bit into his polished boots, but he did not seem to notice. The veneer vanished completely, leaving only a hollow, terrified man staring at the ruins of his conspiracy. He did not scramble forward to clutch at Gideon's heavy cloak and beg for mercy. Instead, Rupert turned his head slowly, his wide, bloodshot eyes locking onto her face. He stared at her as if she were a ghost. He looked at her plain grey dress and the thick bandages wrapping her shoulder. He had spent months negotiating with rival alphas, bypassing patrols, and smuggling explosive oil into the keep. He had treated the lower servants as invisible props, yet his entire empire had been dismantled because a kitchen maid recognized a smell. "You," Rupert whispered, his voice devoid of its former smooth arrogance. "You were nothing. You were nobody. You sweep the ash. You wash the floors." Eva felt no triumphant surge of adrenaline, only the steady certainty of a mathematical equation balancing itself. "I notice things," Eva answered simply. She did not need to explain the mechanics of invisible labor to a man who had never performed it. The people who clean the floors know exactly what is hidden beneath them. Eva just stood beside the king, letting the silence swallow the stablemaster whole. Gideon looked down at Rupert with disgust. "Take him to the holding cells. Let him sit in the cold until the council convenes." The guards hauled the broken man to his feet, dragging him toward the dark maw of the keep's lower levels. The silver coins remained scattered across the table, gleaming uselessly. Gideon turned to her, his dark eyes checking the subtle tension in her uninjured shoulder. He was calibrating her exhaustion, reading the physical toll the morning had taken on her body. "Are you steady, Eva?" he asked, his voice returning to that quiet, protective warmth he reserved only for the infirmary and the hearth. "I am steady, my king," Eva replied. He reached out, his massive hand resting lightly on the small of her back, guiding her back toward the safety of the stone keep. The great hall of Oakhaven Keep held the winter cold deep within its ancient grey masonry. Today the silence was absolute. Eva Vance sat on a high-backed wooden chair to the right of the royal dais. She wore a simple dress of dark wool, her heavily bandaged shoulder resting against the carved armrest. Beside her, little Leo Sterling stood perfectly still, his small fingers woven into the fabric of her uninjured sleeve. Below them, the aristocracy of the pack waited in tense apprehension. At the center of the hall, stripped of his fine leather uniform, Rupert Finch knelt under the guard of 2 royal sentries. The arrogant stablemaster refused to look up, crumbling under the pressure radiating from the high table. King Gideon Sterling stood at the edge of the dais, blocking the weak light from the arched windows. In his right hand he held the stablemaster ledger. He let the book fall onto the heavy oak table. The sound echoed like a musket shot, making nobles flinch. 20 casks of sweet southern paraffin, Gideon said, his voice a carrying rumble. Purchased with foreign silver, moved into the nursery corridors under the cover of the winter feast. He pressed his hand flat against the pages. "The ink is dry, Rupert. You sold the life of the royal heir for a handful of coins." Finch opened his mouth to offer a defense, but the weight of the king's presence crushed the words in his throat. Gideon gave the signal. The guards dragged the ruined traitor out of the hall, the heavy doors groaning shut behind them. The king turned his attention to the gathered court, the luminous and high-born ladies who had spent weeks whispering about the scarred kitchen maid. Gideon stepped down from the dais, his boots making deliberate contact with the stone, stopping in front of Eva. He knelt on one knee. The collective breath of the aristocracy hitched. The king reached out, his calloused fingers hovering just above Eva's collar, where the thick white linen gave way to the angry, puckered red tissue of her burned scar. "You pride yourselves on lineage," Gideon spoke to the court, his tone sharp as cracked ice. "You wear medals forged of gold. You boast of battles fought on distant borders." He kept his gaze locked on Eva's steady eyes. "This woman held a piece of wet canvas apron over my son while the ceiling collapsed in flames. She did not run. She burned so the future of this pack could live." He stood, facing the nobles. "These scars are more honorable than any medal of war," the king declared, leaving no room for debate. "They are the marks of true sovereignty. You will look upon her with the respect owed to a savior, or you will not look upon her at all." For an agonizing moment, the hall remained entirely still. Then an elder beta lowered his gaze, the movement cascading outward like a ripple through a pond. One by one, the wealthy lords and the proud lunars bowed their heads, their expensive silks rustling in the cold air. They bent their necks to the quiet maid who had survived the fire they had failed to prevent. Eva let that knowledge settle into her like cold water into stone, slow, thorough. By nightfall, the exhausting theatre of the tribunal had ended. Eva found herself far away from the drafty hall, seated in the private sanctuary of the sovereign's inner wing. A hearth fire crackled behind an iron grate, filling the room with the scent of cedarwood and melting beeswax. Gideon sat at a mahogany desk near the window, the scratch of his quill pen breaking the silence. He was not drafting battle plans. He was drawing up a permanent, unassailable future. Eva watched him from a velvet armchair. Her injured shoulder throbbed with a dull ache, a profound improvement from the agony of previous weeks. On the thick fur rug at her feet, Leo rested his head directly on Eva's lap. With her uninjured hand, she stroked his soft, silver-blonde hair. Gideon set the quill down. He pressed a brass seal into a pool of hot red wax, leaving the crest of the Alpha King embedded in the document. He walked toward the hearth, bringing the parchment to her himself. "The decree is signed," Gideon said quietly. "It registers you formally as the royal guardian of the heir. It comes with a permanent estate on the southern border, an independent stipend, and absolute immunity from the orders of any lower noble." Eva looked at the document. It was freedom, carefully calculated and legally binding. He was offering her the power to exist entirely on her own terms. "You give me the means to walk away," Eva observed softly. "I give you the right to choose," he corrected, his tone steady. "A cage built of gratitude is still a cage, Eva. You saved my world. I will not trap you inside it." She looked at the fierce, restrained sovereign. He possessed the strength to tear down fortresses, yet he left the door wide open, refusing to force her compliance. It was an ethical exercise of power she had never witnessed before. Eva did not reach for the parchment, letting her good hand continue its rhythmic soothing of Leo's hair. "The southern border is very far away," she murmured, leaning her head back against the cushion, "and I have grown accustomed to the warmth of this particular fire." Gideon's shoulders dropped. He did not pull her into a sudden embrace. Instead, he simply reached out and dragged his heavy oak chair far closer to hers, narrowing the geometry between them until their knees were merely inches apart. He sat down, extending his long legs toward the hearth, and let out a long breath. Outside the windows, the northern wind howled against the stone, driving white snow across the courtyard. But inside the royal wing, the cold could not reach them. Tomorrow, she would wake in a warm bed. She would stand beside the king as an equal. The wet canvas apron that had shielded the pup was long gone, burned to ash, but the safety she had forged remained. No one would ever call her invisible again.